My father is from South Australia, my mother's from New South Wales, and they met during the war and got married fairly soon after the war and came to live in South Australia. My mother had been an actress before the war and in fact in one of the Dad and Dave movies, but she didn't ever do paid work after they got married. My father worked in the hotel industry with his two brothers. Apart from being in the hotel industry, he did very well during the war. He won a military cross in the Middle East and another one on Kokoda, and in the mid-50s became involved in the South Australian RSL and was state president of the RSL, and in 1962 became the national president of the RSL. He was also involved in the racing industry. His father had owned racehorses, and the three brothers, Bob, Jack and my father, also owned a number of successful racehorses. They owned Comic Court, which won the Melbourne Cup in record time in 1950. My parents had 4 children, I was the eldest, and as we all got older they became clearer that they wanted a house of their own to come to, and decided that they would build one at Victor Harbour. They decided clearly to have a house in Encounter Bay, and they looked for quite some time. At that point there were large numbers of vacant blocks on the seafront. They were keen to be one back from the sea because they were worried about traffic with the 4 children, but they also wanted to have a view of the sea, and so it made sense to be over closer to the bluff where the land rose fairly quickly from the seafront, and the house looked straight out over the top of the houses in front of us. The house was designed by James Hall in 1958, and I understand that he was at that point the president of the South Australian Institute of Architects. The main objective was to have a house that was easy to maintain, to look after, and very relaxed to live in. It is well set into the hillside, and when in fact it was built, there were very few houses behind it, and beyond that was a dairy farm. So you'd look up from the beach and see this house, but it wasn't high enough to stand out above the rise of the land. So if, for example, you're out in the bay in a boat, it can be quite hard to pick this house out, as opposed to some of the more modern houses, which seem to be somewhat more obvious. The house is of double brick construction. From our point of view, means that the maintenance is probably significantly less than it might otherwise be, because structurally it's extremely sound. There's almost no cracking whatsoever, even though it's now over 60 years old. The house is an oblong shape with a long corridor down the middle and very easy to move around. So at one end there's a dining room, the lounge room, and next to the dining room the kitchen, and the bedrooms and bathrooms are all at the other end. Internally it's got timber floors. The 3 main bedrooms along the front of the house are divided essentially by built-in cupboards. There's a balcony running right along the front of the house. The main room is really the feature room. It's got a very large picture window. Wright Island is set right between 2 Norfolk Island pines when you look out that window. I'm not sure how deliberate that was, because when the house was built, the Norfolk Island pines were not yet tall enough to be seen above the horizon. So they were very much younger trees, but it does frame the island very nicely. The house has steel beams over that window to allow the window to be put in. It's 10mm plate glass, and as I understand it back then, that was very unusual. My mother certainly believed that it was as large a window as she could get into the house. She was very keen to have as much light as possible. There are windows both on the side of the room as well as the front of the room, so that it's always been very light-filled. It was also built to accommodate household help. So there was a bedroom for the maid who my mother employed. She, by and large, did most of the cooking. My mother did some of the cooking, but it was one of the advantages for my mother of coming down here was having a break. While living here wasn't very different from living at Toorak Gardens, the houses were very different. The Toorak Gardens house was certainly much more formal. We certainly felt we had a lot of space in the Toorak Gardens house, and I don't ever remember feeling confined in this house, but it's certainly a smaller house than the house we lived in Adelaide. The use of the house really was, I suppose, how most people would use holiday houses, and it just felt like a very relaxed place to be. And my parents originally certainly found this house an easy house to relax in, I think. We would spend probably 5 or 6 weeks over the summer down here if we possibly could. Victor Harbour back then was, of course, very different than it is now. The population was much smaller. It felt very much like a very small country town. You could get in and out of Victor very quickly. There was no problem finding a car park. We would go in and get fresh bread every day, basically. We would come back and sit down outside to lunch, all of us together. One of my fondest memories of staying in the house is swimming, particularly in the summer. On hot summer's day, we would often go for a swim before breakfast, usually down to Petrel Cove, but depending where the wind was, sometimes in the cove around by the jetty on the bluff, where it was more protected. And the other thing that I remember very fondly is that we used to have a billy and get fresh milk from Sweetman's farm. We would turn up with a billy, Mrs. Sweetman would fill it for us, and the only dilemma with getting the milk was getting back here without spilling the billy, of course. One of the reasons I think they chose Encounter Bay was that there are a whole range of activities that they could undertake and that the 4 children could undertake. So there was a sense of, for me at least, of wanting to get away from it all. I was a bit of an introvert, and coming down to Encounter Bay allowed me to feel a lot freer than I was able to feel in town.